The husband and mother-in-law went on vacation, leaving the daughter-in-law alone with her sick father-in-law. But the next day he got up and said something that changed everything. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching us from. The grand estate of the Whitmore family stood as a silent monument to wealth and legacy, its towering spires and expansive gardens whispering of generations past. The air inside the mansion was heavy with tradition, suffused with the scent of polished wood and the faint trace of lavender from the ever-burning candles that lined the halls. To an outsider, it was a vision of opulence, a place where privilege reigned and prosperity seemed eternal. But to Clara, it was nothing more than a gilded cage. She had entered this world through marriage, bound by vows to Lawrence Whitmore, the only son of the formidable Eleanor Whitmore and heir to a fortune that had withstood the test of time. She had imagined a life of security, perhaps even happiness, but the reality of her existence within these walls had proven vastly different from her expectations. The moment she set foot in the mansion as Lawrence's wife, it became clear that she was not an equal partner in this family. She was an addition, an ornament, a presence tolerated rather than embraced. Eleanor, the matriarch of the Whitmore family, had made her stance clear from the beginning. Her pale, elegant face was an impenetrable mask of civility, but her eyes held nothing but quiet disdain whenever they settled upon Clara. There were no outright insults, no dramatic confrontations. Eleanor's power did not need to be so blatant. Instead, she wove her authority into carefully measured words, into the expectation of compliance, into the way she ensured that Clara was always in the background, never truly belonging. Lawrence, for his part, remained indifferent. He was neither cruel nor particularly affectionate. Their marriage had been one of convenience more than passion, an arrangement that suited him and one that Clara had naively believed might evolve into something more. But Lawrence was a man of his mother's making, shaped by privilege and a belief that duty was more important than sentiment. He traveled often, dined at exclusive clubs, surrounded himself with the kind of people who never questioned his place in the world. And Clara, despite wearing the title of his wife, remained an afterthought. When Eleanor and Lawrence announced their plans to travel to Paris for an extended holiday, Clara had not been surprised that she was not invited. "It will be a brief trip," Lawrence had said with a reassuring smile, though it held no real warmth. "And someone must stay behind to care for Father." By father, he meant William Whitmore, the patriarch of the family, a man whom Clara had rarely exchanged more than a few words with. He had been bedridden for years, silent and frail, the shadow of a man who had once commanded respect across business and society. No one spoke much of him, except to acknowledge his condition in passing. And so it had fallen to Clara, as it always did, to take on the task no one else wanted. That morning, as she stood on the front steps of the mansion, watching Eleanor and Lawrence depart in their sleek black car, she felt the weight of her solitude settle heavily upon her shoulders. For the first few hours, she wandered through the vast, empty corridors of the estate, absorbing the silence that seemed thicker in their absence. The servants went about their duties with well-practiced efficiency, acknowledging her presence only with curt nods before retreating into their own world. She had no real power here, despite her title. The estate was Eleanor's domain, and every member of the household knew where true authority lay. In the afternoon, she made her way to William's quarters, feeling the dull tug of obligation. His room was at the far end of the mansion, separate from the grandeur of the rest of the house. Heavy curtains blocked most of the daylight, casting the space into perpetual gloom. The air smelled faintly of old books and medicine, and in the center of it all, William sat in a large chair by the window, his thin frame draped in a blanket. Clara hesitated at the threshold. She had seen him before, of course, in passing or at formal dinners where he had been wheeled out like a relic of the past, but she had never truly spoken to him. He had always been silent, his face impassive, his presence more like that of a statue than a living man. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, unsure if he would even respond. To her shock, his head turned slightly, and his sharp, piercing eyes met hers. "You don't have to call me that," he said. His voice was quiet, rough from disuse, but clear. "William will do." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She had never heard him speak so lucidly. In all the time she had known him, he had been little more than a ghost in the house, present but absent. And yet, here he was, looking at her with an intensity that unsettled her. I wasn't sure if you—" She trailed off, unsure of what to say. "You weren't sure if I could speak?" His lips curled into something that almost resembled amusement. "They like to pretend I'm not here. Makes it easier for them." Clara swallowed. Them. He meant Eleanor and Lawrence. She stepped further into the room, drawn in by his sudden clarity. Why have you never spoken before?" William exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to the window. "Because I needed to see," he said. "To observe, to understand what was happening around me." She frowned. "And what have you understood?" His eyes met hers again, and this time there was something calculating in them. "That my family is waiting for me to die," he said, "and that you are the only one in this house who has no part in their plans." The words sent a chill through Clara's spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. William studied her for a long moment before answering. "They are not as careful as they think they are. I may have been silent, but I have not been deaf." He leaned slightly forward, his frail hands gripping the arms of his chair. "Lawrence and Eleanor have been making arrangements, changing documents, moving assets, all in preparation for the moment I'm no longer here." Clara's stomach twisted. The implications of his words settled heavily upon her. "And what do they plan to do with me?" she asked. William gave a small, bitter smile. "You are a placeholder, a convenient piece of the puzzle while they need you. But once they have secured what they want, you will no longer serve a purpose." Clara felt the weight of those words press against her chest. For the first time, she saw the truth clearly. She had never been part of this family. She had been tolerated, used, and eventually discarded. But now, standing in the dimly lit room, under the gaze of the man who had been ignored for so long, she realized something else. She was not powerless, and she was not alone. Clara sat in the dimly lit study, her mind reeling from William's revelation. The silence in the mansion felt heavier than before, pressing against her like an unseen force. Every detail of her life in this house, the quiet dismissals, the veiled insults, the way Lawrence treated her as an afterthought, now took on a more sinister shape. She had thought she was simply neglected, an inconvenience to be tolerated. But now she knew the truth. She was nothing more than a temporary figure in their grand scheme, a pawn in a game she hadn't even realized was being played. She turned her gaze to William, who sat across from her in his armchair, his fingers absently tapping against the polished wood. He had shed the frailty she had always associated with him. Now he seemed sharper, more present, as though the weight of pretense had finally lifted from his shoulders. His sharp eyes studied her, waiting for her to speak. "So you're telling me," Clara finally said, her voice careful, that Lawrence and Eleanor are planning to take everything from you?" William gave a slow nod. "They've been planning it for years. I just let them believe I was too far gone to notice." Clara shook her head. "I don't understand. If you knew, why didn't you do something? Why pretend to be weak?" A small, bitter smile tugged at William's lips. "Because when you are perceived as weak, people show their true selves. If I had fought back too soon, they would have been more careful. Instead, I let them believe they were winning, that I was slipping away." He leaned forward slightly. "And in doing so, I learned the extent of their betrayal." Clara swallowed hard. It was difficult to grasp. William Whitmore had not been a victim of his failing body. He had been playing a long game, one of patience and silence. But what did that mean for her? She crossed her arms. "And where do I fit into this?" William studied her for a long moment before answering. "You are the one thing they didn't account for, the one person in this house who is not actively working against me." His expression darkened. "And the only one who will listen." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She had never considered herself a key player in the affairs of the Whitmore family. She had always been on the periphery, caught in the undertow of their power struggles. But now, William was telling her that she was something else entirely, something unexpected. She didn't know whether to feel honored or afraid. William turned away, reaching for something in the drawer of his desk. He pulled out a small recording device and placed it on the table between them. "I started recording them months ago. Conversations, phone calls. I couldn't rely on my word alone, not when they could claim I was senile." Clara hesitated before reaching for the device. Her fingers hovered over it before she pressed the play button. The first voice she heard was Lawrence's. "She has no idea," he said, his tone casual, as though he were discussing something as mundane as dinner plans. "But we need to speed this up. Time is against us." Clara's breath caught. Then Eleanor's voice, smooth, detached, yet dripping with something venomous. "Clara is a distraction. As soon as the inheritance is secured, she can be dealt with." A long silence filled the room as the recording ended. Clara's hands clenched into fists. The words were worse than she had expected. They weren't just planning to take William's fortune, they were planning to get rid of her, dealt with. She forced herself to look up at William. "So they plan to erase me from the picture." William's gaze didn't waver. "You were never meant to last, Clara. You were convenient. They needed Lawrence to marry someone respectable, someone who wouldn't cause trouble. And once they had what they wanted," he gestured toward the recorder. "Well, you heard them." Clara felt her pulse quicken. She had never loved Lawrence, not truly, but she had believed in the sanctity of their marriage. She had believed, at the very least, that she had a place here. But that had been a lie. A slow anger began to build inside her, raw and unfamiliar. She had spent years molding herself to fit into this world, biting her tongue, stepping aside when required. And for what? To be discarded like a piece of unwanted furniture the moment it had suited them. She exhaled shakily. "What do we do?" William raised an eyebrow. "We?" Clara lifted her chin. "You said it yourself. I'm the one person they didn't account for. They underestimate me. That's an advantage." For the first time, William smiled. Not the bitter, weary smile he had worn before, but something genuine. "You're smarter than they think." Clara leaned forward. "Then let's make sure they never see it coming." William nodded. "We'll need help." He stood, moving to a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. With a flick of his wrist, he turned the key and pulled out a thick envelope. Clara could see the name of a law firm printed neatly across the front. "Nathan Moore," William said, handing it to her. "My lawyer. The only one I trust. He's been working on a contingency plan for some time now." Clara flipped through the documents inside. They were complicated, filled with legal terminology she barely understood, but she could grasp the essence of it. A restructuring of William's estate, a transfer of assets, a new name on accounts that had once belonged to the Whitmore empire. Her name. She looked up, startled. "You want me to take control?" William nodded. "It's the only way to keep it out of their hands." Clara hesitated. The weight of it all was staggering. She had never imagined herself in a position like this. The Whitmore fortune was built on decades of power and manipulation, and now she was being asked to take the reins. But then she remembered the way Eleanor had looked at her, the casual cruelty in Lawrence's voice. Dealt with. Clara straightened her spine. "Then let's do it." Over the next few days, Clara and William worked in secret. She met with Nathan Moore, who wasted no time drawing up the necessary paperwork. Accounts were transferred, signatures were finalized, and the estate's holdings began to shift under the radar. Clara kept up the facade, acting as though nothing had changed. She answered Lawrence's occasional calls with polite indifference, reassured him that everything was as they had left it. She even sent Eleanor a message about some trivial matter regarding the household staff, ensuring that nothing seemed amiss. But beneath the surface, the mansion was no longer theirs. By the time Lawrence and Eleanor returned from Paris, everything they had built was already slipping through their fingers. And Clara was waiting. Clara stood in the dimly lit hallway of the Whitmore mansion, her fingers tightening around the papers in her hands. The documents felt heavier than they were, their weight pressing down on her as she fully grasped the magnitude of what she was about to do. Everything she had known in this house, every quiet moment of dismissal, every carefully measured glance from Eleanor, every cold, indifferent touch from Lawrence, had led to this. The legal transition was nearly complete. The fortune that Eleanor and Lawrence had been so certain would fall into their hands was slipping away from them, signed over to the charitable foundation that Nathan Moore had helped establish. A few more signatures, a few more days, and their empire of deceit would crumble beneath them. But they couldn't suspect anything. Not yet. Clara took a deep breath and reminded herself that this was the most dangerous part of the plan. The moment Eleanor or Lawrence caught even a hint of suspicion, they would fight back. They would dig, manipulate, use every connection they had to try to reverse what was happening. She had seen them do it before, to business rivals, to distant family members who had dared to stand in their way. If they caught on too soon, everything would be for nothing. She had to play the role they expected her to play. So when Lawrence called that afternoon, his voice smooth and lazy over the phone, Clara forced herself to sound exactly as she always had. "How are things at home?" he asked, not because he truly cared, but because he wanted to ensure everything remained under his control. Clara shifted the phone against her ear and kept her voice light. "Quiet. Nothing out of the ordinary." "Good," Lawrence said. She could hear the clinking of glass on his end, likely some overpriced drink in a lavish Parisian lounge. "Mother and I were just discussing our plans for when we return. I trust Father hasn't been too much trouble." She forced out a soft chuckle. "Not at all. He mostly keeps to himself." "Of course." There was something smug in the way he said it, as if William had always been a non-factor in his life. "We'll be back in a few days. Try not to let anything go to chaos before then." "I'll do my best." The call ended, and Clara lowered the phone, staring at the black screen. She hated how easily he spoke to her, how effortlessly he dismissed everything, how little regard he had for the house, for his own father, for anything that did not serve him. But she swallowed the anger down. Soon it wouldn't matter. She had to focus. The next morning, Nathan arrived at the estate, his dark blue suit crisp and impeccably pressed, his briefcase filled with the last of the documents they needed. Clara met him in the study where William sat waiting by the window, the morning light casting deep shadows across his lined face. "It's almost done," Nathan said as he set the papers on the desk. "By the time they return, everything will be finalized." Clara nodded, but she could feel the tension tightening in her chest. They were so close, but the final stretch was always the most treacherous. "There's one last thing," Nathan continued, flipping through the documents. "We need their signatures on these last few revisions before the transition is irreversible. Nothing too obvious, just routine paperwork disguised as part of the estate's upkeep." William exhaled slowly. "So we need to get them to sign without realizing what they're signing." Nathan nodded. "Exactly." Clara stared down at the stack of legal papers. It was an audacious move, but a necessary one. They couldn't leave anything to chance. "They never read the fine print," William said after a moment. "They believe they're untouchable. That's their weakness." Clara traced a finger along the edge of one of the pages. She had watched Lawrence sign countless documents without a second glance. He was too arrogant to imagine that someone else could outmaneuver him. But Eleanor was another matter. "She's careful," Clara murmured. "She notices things." "She's not as careful as she thinks," William said. "She believes she's already won." Clara nodded. That was the key. Eleanor had spent so long seeing Clara as insignificant that she wouldn't expect a challenge. Nathan placed a pen on top of the papers. "This is the final step. Once they sign, it's over." Clara met William's gaze. For the first time, she saw something almost like hope in his tired eyes. "We'll make sure they do," she said. For the next few days, Clara moved carefully, ensuring that everything appeared normal. She kept up her routine, managed the household as expected, even made casual calls to Lawrence to maintain the illusion of normalcy. But beneath the surface, every moment was calculated. She spent hours with William, reviewing the documents, rehearsing the moment when they would present them to Eleanor and Lawrence. They had to time it perfectly. The moment had to feel natural, expected, just another tedious formality in the running of the estate. And then the day arrived. The sound of tires crunching against the driveway filled the air, followed by the smooth purr of an expensive engine shutting off. Clara stood by the window, watching as the sleek black car came to a stop. The doors opened, and out stepped Eleanor first, moving with her usual regal precision. Behind her, Lawrence emerged, stretching his arms as though he had endured some great hardship. They were home. Clara took a deep breath. It was time. She descended the stairs at a measured pace, keeping her expression composed. Eleanor and Lawrence entered the grand foyer, their designer luggage being carried in by the staff. "Clara," Eleanor said smoothly, her keen eyes sweeping over her, "I trust you managed to keep everything in order." Clara smiled politely. "Of course, everything has been taken care of." Lawrence placed a hand on her waist, the gesture practiced rather than affectionate. "Good. We'll discuss some estate matters later. There are a few things I'll need to review." Clara inclined her head. "Actually, Father has already prepared everything. There are just a few final signatures needed for the routine updates." Lawrence barely glanced at her as he shrugged off his coat. "Send them to my office. I'll take care of them later." Clara fought to keep her voice even. "Father thought it best to handle everything now, while you're both together." Eleanor's gaze flickered, a small hesitation, but then, predictably, her confidence took over. "Very well, let's get it over with." Minutes later, they were gathered in the study. William sat at his desk, the documents neatly arranged before him. He greeted them with a slow nod, his expression unreadable. "This shouldn't take long," he said, gesturing to the papers. "Just standard updates to the estate's holdings. Nothing complicated." Lawrence barely looked at the documents as he reached for the pen. Eleanor, however, hesitated. "What kind of updates?" she asked. William didn't blink. "Minor adjustments to some trusts, ensuring tax efficiency. You know how tedious these things are." Eleanor studied him, but she saw only the frail old man she had always known. He had played this role for so long that she had no reason to doubt it. Slowly, she picked up the pen. Clara held her breath, and then, with one final flourish, Eleanor signed her name. It was done. The ink dried, sealing their fate. Clara exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain still to maintain her role. Eleanor and Lawrence had just signed away everything they had schemed for, and they had no idea. The night after the papers were signed, Clara barely slept. The weight of what had just happened settled deep in her bones, humming beneath her skin like an electrical current. The Whitmore fortune was no longer under Eleanor and Lawrence's control. Every asset, every account, every carefully guarded investment had been transferred to the foundation, and they had signed it away without a second thought. Yet, despite the triumph, Clara knew the hardest part was still ahead. The moment Eleanor and Lawrence realized what had happened, they would not take it quietly. They would fight. They would lash out, clawing for any chance to regain what had been stolen from them. She had seen the kind of ruthlessness they were capable of, and now they had nothing left to lose. The following morning, she found herself pacing the halls of the estate, listening to the muffled sounds of movement as the staff resumed their daily routines. The mansion felt different now, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. And then it did. The sound of glass shattering from the study sent a sharp jolt through her chest. Clara turned swiftly, her pulse racing, and hurried toward the room. As she reached the doorway, she saw Lawrence standing behind the desk, his hand still curled into a fist, blood dripping from his knuckles. On the floor, among the shards of broken glass, lay the heavy crystal decanter that had once rested on William's desk. The strong scent of spilled whiskey filled the air. Eleanor stood beside him, her expression eerily calm, though her eyes burned with cold fury. A stack of documents lay open before them, their own signatures staring back at them in cruel betrayal. Clara took a step inside. "I see you've reviewed the paperwork." Lawrence's head snapped up, his face twisted with rage. "What the hell is this?" he spat, his voice raw with disbelief. "What have you done?" William, who had been sitting in his chair by the window, finally turned his gaze toward his son. His face, lined with age and wisdom, held none of the fear Lawrence had likely expected to see. Instead, there was only certainty. "I protected what was mine," William said simply. Lawrence let out a bitter laugh, but there was nothing humorous about it. "You think this is over?" He pointed a trembling finger at the documents. "You think you can just steal everything from me and expect me to accept it?" William didn't flinch. You stole it from yourself the moment you decided my life was worth less than my money." Eleanor finally spoke, her voice steady, razor sharp. "This will not stand." Clara folded her arms, her expression unreadable. "It already has." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "You think you've won?" She took a slow step forward, her presence as imposing as ever. "You are nothing, Clara. A woman plucked from obscurity, paraded around in a world where you don't belong. You have no right to what's in those papers, and I promise you, you will not keep it." Clara met her gaze head on, refusing to be intimidated. "That's where you're wrong. You and Lawrence signed everything over yourselves. Legally, there is nothing you can do." Eleanor's lips curled in a cruel smirk. "Oh, my dear, you don't seem to understand who you're dealing with. We have resources, connections. This," she gestured to the documents, "is nothing more than a temporary inconvenience." Clara's stomach twisted, but she didn't let it show. She had known this wouldn't be easy. She had expected them to fight, and she had prepared for it. William shifted slightly in his chair. "That's why we took precautions," he said, his voice quieter now, but no less firm. Clara reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a small recording device. She placed it on the desk and pressed play. The room filled with the sound of their own voices. Lawrence's arrogant drawl, "She has no idea, but we need to speed this up. Time is against us." Eleanor's smooth, dismissive tone, "Clara is a distraction. As soon as inheritance is secured, she can be dealt with." The recording played on, each word sharpening like a knife. Every hushed conversation, every plan they had whispered behind closed doors, now laid bare for all to hear. Lawrence's face drained of color. Eleanor's jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the edge of the desk so hard her knuckles turned white. When the recording ended, silence filled the room. Clara leaned forward slightly. "You were saying something about resources?" Lawrence took a step back, his hands shaking with suppressed rage. "You?" His voice cracked before he could finish the sentence. Eleanor, however, composed herself faster. "You think this will hold up in court?" she sneered. "You have no idea how the world works, do you? Evidence like this means nothing against the right legal team." William chuckled under his breath. "Then it's a good thing this isn't the only copy." Clara crossed her arms. "We've already shared it with the lawyers, and a few other places." She tilted her head, "just in case something unexpected happens." Eleanor's expression darkened. For the first time, a sliver of doubt flickered in her cold blue eyes. William leaned back in his chair. "The house is no longer yours. The fortune is no longer yours. You have 1 week to remove your belongings and leave." Lawrence slammed his fist against the desk. "You think you can throw us out like common criminals?" William exhaled. "You threw yourselves out. I only gave you the final push." Eleanor turned to Lawrence, her face carefully composed, but Clara could see the strain behind her eyes. They were backed into a corner. They knew it. There would be no court battle, no drawn-out legal dispute. They had signed the papers willingly, and the recordings were more than enough to ensure no challenge would hold. They had lost. Eleanor straightened her spine, smoothing down the front of her perfectly tailored jacket. "Come, Lawrence," she said. "We won't waste another moment in this house." Lawrence stood frozen, his fists clenched at his sides. His whole life, his power, his wealth, his control, had been ripped from his grasp, and there was nothing he could do about it. At last, he turned on his heel and stormed out of the study. The heavy sound of his footsteps echoed through the mansion as he disappeared down the hall. Eleanor lingered for just a moment longer, her gaze flickering between Clara and William. "You will regret this," she murmured. "Both of you." Clara didn't blink. "I doubt that." Eleanor said nothing more. She simply turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the polished floor until she was gone. Clara let out a slow breath. The house, once so heavy with their presence, now felt lighter. William smiled at her, weary but triumphant. "It's over." Clara nodded, but deep inside, she knew it wasn't just an ending. It was a beginning. The morning after Eleanor and Lawrence left the Whitmore mansion for the last time, the house felt impossibly quiet. The absence of their presence was like the lifting of a dense fog, an unfamiliar clarity settling over the grand halls and echoing corridors. For the first time, the mansion did not feel like a prison. It felt like a place of possibility. Clara stood in front of the large, gilded mirror in the main hallway, staring at her reflection. She looked different than she had weeks ago. The woman who had first entered this house as Lawrence Whitmore's wife had been careful, cautious, unsure of her place. The woman who stared back at her now was something else entirely. She had fought. She had won. But there was still so much to do. When she turned, she saw William watching her from the entrance to the study. He leaned heavily on his cane, his frail frame casting a long shadow against the polished wooden floor. Yet, despite the weight of his years, there was something different about him, too. He looked lighter. Not physically, but as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. "You should get some rest," he said. "It's been a long battle." Clara shook her head. "There's no time for rest. We have work to do." William chuckled, stepping forward with slow, deliberate movements. Spoken like someone who has finally realized her own power. She smiled faintly, but there was truth in his words. She was no longer just a woman on the sidelines of this family. She had taken control of her fate, and with it, she had inherited something even greater, the responsibility of shaping what came next. Together, they made their way to the study, where stacks of papers still lined the desk. Legal documents finalizing the transfer of assets, proposals for restructuring the estate's finances, letters from Nathan Moore confirming that every last trace of Eleanor and Lawrence's influence had been erased. But, more importantly, there were the blueprints for the future, the framework for the charitable foundation that would turn the Whitmore legacy into something far greater than wealth. Clara ran her fingers over the documents, exhaling slowly. "It feels different now," she admitted. "The house, everything, like it's finally free." William settled into his chair. "Because it is, and so are you." She looked at him, realizing how much he had changed as well. For years, he had been a man trapped in his own silence, watching as his own flesh and blood conspired against him. But now, he had taken back control. He had made his choice, and he had chosen her. Clara sat across from him, feeling the weight of their victory, but also the enormity of what lay ahead. "The foundation," she said, tapping the papers. "It's time to make it real." William nodded. "It's yours now. I built a fortune, but you," he gestured toward her, "you will build something greater." It was an overwhelming thought, but Clara did not shrink from it. She had been trapped in this house for too long, living under the shadow of Eleanor's control, treated as though she were nothing more than an accessory to Lawrence's name. But now she had the power to make sure no one else felt that way. She picked up the phone and dialed Nathan Moore. When he answered, she spoke with certainty. "Make the announcement. the Whitmore Foundation is officially open. The transformation of the estate began within days. The towering, imposing grandeur of the Whitmore mansion was softened, not in its physical structure, but in its purpose. Rooms once filled with expensive, meaningless trinkets were repurposed into offices and meeting spaces. The grand ballroom, which had once been reserved for elite galas and aristocratic affairs, was turned into a community hall for outreach programs. The name Whitmore, once synonymous with cold authority and inherited privilege, began to take on a new meaning. People came, women in need of shelter, young students seeking scholarships, families struggling to find their footing. The wealth that had once been hoarded behind these walls was now reaching those who truly needed it. Clara walked through the halls, overseeing the changes, ensuring every piece of the Foundation's mission was being executed. She met with program directors, financial advisors, and legal experts, building something lasting, something real. She no longer felt like a guest in this house. She was its future. One afternoon, she found William in the garden, sitting beneath the shade of an old oak tree. He had taken to spending more time outside lately, no longer confined to the dim corners of the mansion. She sat beside him, their gazes drifting over the newly planted flowers along the garden path. It was strange to think of how much had changed in such a short time. William let out a soft sigh. "I never thought I'd see this place used for something good." Clara smiled. "Neither did I." He turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "You did something I never could, Clara. You turned this house into something more than a monument to greed." She looked down at her hands, thinking about everything it had taken to get here. "I just did what had to be done." William chuckled. "That's what makes you different from them." She knew he was right. Eleanor and Lawrence had seen the world as something to conquer, something to control. They had only cared about their own wealth, their own power. And when Clara had first arrived, they had expected her to fall in line, to play her part in their carefully curated illusion. But she had broken free. And in doing so, she had built something greater than any of them had ever imagined. Months passed, the foundation flourished, the estate became a beacon of hope, drawing in those who needed it most. And Clara had become something she never expected, a leader. She stood before the mirror once more, but this time she did not search for something familiar in her reflection. She knew who she was now. She had been underestimated, dismissed, seen as temporary. And yet, she was still here, stronger than ever. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. She turned to see Nathan standing there, a file in his hands. "It's done," he said. "The final documents. The foundation is officially recognized. Everything is secure." Clara took the file, running her fingers over the cover before looking up at him. "Thank you." Nathan nodded. "You did this, Clara." She smiled. "No, we did this." She stepped out of the room and into the hallway, the sound of voices echoing from downstairs, staff working, people gathering, lives changing. This house had once been a prison. Now it was a legacy, her legacy, and she was just getting started. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more like it. Share this video with others who might love it too. And if you're ready for more, check out the next one.